get started, and we'll try to get through this tonight in one piece. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, again, we're so happy and privileged to be able to come before you, to open your word and to see what you have set for us tonight. Lord, I pray you will anoint the word as it goes out, anoint my lips to say those things that you'd have me to say, and anoint our hearts to receive. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so we pick up where we left off. Both Abner and Ishbosheth have been killed now. And so what that means is that 11 tribes of the 12 are now without any leader. So you've got 11 individual tribes. They have their individual elders, but they're not united. And this is where we pick this up tonight. So let's start with 2 Samuel chapter 5, beginning with verse 1. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and spoke, saying, Indeed, we are your bone and your flesh. Also in time past, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and brought them in, and the Lord said to you, You shall shepherd my people Israel, and be over Israel. Therefore all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. Okay, so we start off here with all the tribes coming to David at Hebron. Now, we kind of have to assume a little bit. But you know, the Philistines were always coming against Israel. And so here was a great opportunity. Under Saul, they were united. And so every time the Philistines would start cutting up, Saul would go out and defeat them. And so now Saul's gone. The main army of Israel is gone. So here's a great opportunity to take back all their land and, you know, get in there and destroy them. So this was an opportunity for them, and this is probably what was the primary drive behind the elders of Israel, wanting to get together. They knew they had to unite, and who was the obvious one to be their king would be David. And so that's really kind of what they're saying here. They were number one, they observed that they were all children of Israel. Now, we learned last week that, you know, that the 11 were fighting against Judah. They seemed to be in conflict all the time. David was king of Judah, just the one tribe. But Judah was a big tribe. So, I mean, it wasn't like it was a big, very powerful tribe, especially under David. And so they were constantly fighting and bickering. So now they come to David and they say, we're all of the same bone. In other words, you know, hey, we're all Hebrews. It's time we put our fighting aside, differences aside, and let's unite. And it's kind of interesting here. They admitted that David had been the one who led the armies of Saul in victory after victory. Well, they also knew that Samuel had anointed David to be the next king of Israel. That was common knowledge. Of course, we read that in 1 Samuel chapter 16. They knew that eventually David was going to be the king of Israel. Anyway, what I find fascinating is, you know, when you read through these stories, people like the elders of Israel, they hear the prophecy of the prophet, and they recognize Samuel as the prophet. You think as soon as the prophet made that proclamation, they'd line up. You know, hey, David, come on, right now, let's do it. But they all seem to always kind of defer to their own ideas and their own. Of course, isn't that the way it is today? The same thing today. We would rather have our own agendas than what God has already said that we need to do. And so there they were, and they finally came to this decision. And then there's something else here that's interesting, and that's in verse 2. You were the one who led Israel out and brought them in. In other words, you led the armies out from the cities and you brought them back in. In other words, you were the one that was marching the armies in and out. That's what they're saying here. And the Lord said to you. Now, how did they know what the Lord said to him?
Right.
But notice what they said. The Lord said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over Israel. That has some very interesting connotations here, I think. And when you look at David, of course, was a shepherd, but it wasn't his sheep that he was shepherding. It was always his father's sheep. So we know he never had sheep until he was king. So he never really had any of his own sheep. He was always shepherding somebody else's sheep. And David said in Psalms 78, verse 70, he also chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the ewes that had young, he brought him to shepherd Jacob, his people, and Israel, his inheritance. So he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands.
78 what?
78 verse 70 and to 73, I think.
70, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
72, 70 to 72. The point being here is the people recognized that they could have said, and God said to you, you're going to be our king. See, Saul was the king. These were his people. He was the king. And he made that known. I'm the king. If you don't agree with me, I'll just kill you. Because I can. I'm the king. In other words, he took lordship over Israel. David, on the other hand, came to be the shepherd of Israel. Not his sheep.
Right.
Jacob's sheep, or meaning God's sheep. He recognized his position. The leaders here recognized that same idea by saying, God told you to be the shepherd. He didn't call you to be our king. He didn't call you to be the one that marches first into the place, and gets all the glory. He told you to be a shepherd over my people and be ruler over my people. So he was to be the shepherd. It wasn't his people, but he was to rule over God's people. In other words, be the judge, be the prophet, be the one who makes the decisions, and is the physical. I don't want to be careful here, but he was. I don't want to say he was God in the flesh, because he obviously was not divine, but he took the place of God visually to the people. He was the one that if they looked at David, they should see God. Okay. You understand that? I'm not saying he was divine.
So God didn't say that David could be the king?
What's that?
David is not the king?
Oh, he was the king, yes, he was king. But the point being, he wasn't king over his own people, he was king over God's people. He recognized that God was the one who had the people. His job was just to be the shepherd. Yes, he was the king, yes, he had all that authority. But how you use that authority? And we see in David, he didn't do anything that he didn't ask God first. He did. Right. But he always ended up going to go back and do it again, and end up asking God. We'll see that tonight, But that's why one reason he was called a man after God's own heart, because he constantly recognized his position, not being the despot king, I'm just the shepherd. And I have title of king and I have all this authority, but really all this authority only comes from God. And today, that is actually a very, very hard trait to find in a lot of pastors today. Excuse me. Even pastors who are successful or appear to be successful, they have this opinion that God put me in this position, therefore I am the pastor. Put a little thing on their desk, the buck stops here. And really, when you look at those pastors, especially those in the past, I like to go back to the past because there are so many preachers back then that really understood this concept. You look at people like Spurgeon. I mean, his prayer meetings, there was thousands of people that came to his prayer meetings. You don't get that kind of
audience
backing having at your church. It was God's church. And he writes about it. It's God's church. I don't do anything. God doesn't tell me to do it. I'm not doing it. I have to rely on him. But so many pastors today rely on themselves. And this is the way I've always done it. This is the way we're going to continue to do it. And I think this is the way to do it. I feel this is what we should do. Well, your feelings and what you think really doesn't matter very much when it comes to what God wants. Now, if you prayed about it, I'm not, obviously that's what you do it. But I see so many preachers that it's just all about me. I've said it before, it drives me nuts when all I see when I walk into a church is a pastor's pictures. The pastor and the pastor's wife pictures, big banners. Oh, this is my ministry. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. It's God's ministry. You're just somebody being used. And you can be gone tomorrow, just in a split second, and it'll all be gone. All right. All right. All the elders came together in Hebron, and they made a covenant with David to follow to follow David was their covenant. They would follow him, and then they anointed him king. Now this covenant, or we might even call it a constitution for the nation, was really kind of more what it was. Now it says here, and they made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. Now this can have a couple of three different meanings. One, it can mean before the ark, but the ark wasn't in Hebron, so we know it wasn't that. It can also be before the priest who's clothed with the ephod, whereby he was in a manner put into God's presence, which is an interesting concept. And in fact probably was very much the case, from what we've already learned about the priest and the ephod. When they would put their ephod on, they were able to convey God's desires to the king or whoever was asking. Probably would speak through the voice. God would speak through their voice, put it that way. And the third one, in the congregation of the mighty or magistrates, where God used to be present. And you see that in Psalms 82 and 1. In the public assembly, now met together in God's name and fear, and as in his presence, to call upon him, to appeal to him as the witness and judge of their transactions. And you can compare Judges 11 and 11, 1 Samuel 23 and 18. Some scriptures you can look at. Then they anointed David either by a prophet or the priest to whom the office belonged. And of course, 2 Samuel 2 and 4. Now it gives us, it's kind of interesting, the Bible just gives us some information here about David. He was made king of Judah when he was 30 years old. He was made king over all Israel when he was 37 and a half, and he ruled a total of 33 years. So he was 70, I guess, when he finally died. He was in his early 70s anyway, depending on how you look at it. The age of David, and this is from Barnes, the age of David is conclusive as to the fact that the earlier years of Saul's reign, during which Jonathan grew up to be a man, are passed over in silence, and that the events narrated from 1 Samuel 13 to the end of the book did not occupy more than 10 years. So all of 1 Samuel from chapter 13 on only actually covered about 10 years. The first 10 years of Saul's reign, or that big chunk out of there, we have no idea what went on. It's not recorded. This is while Jonathan was growing up and so on. It's kind of interesting. If David was 20 years old at the time he killed Goliath, 4 years in Saul's service, 4 years of wandering from place to place, 1 year and 4 months in the country of the Philistines, and a few months after Saul's death would make up the 10 years necessary to bring him to the age of 30. Because he was approximately the same age as Jonathan. So, anyway, that's kind of some interesting facts for you. All right, so let's go on. Verse 6. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who spoke to David, saying, You shall not come in here, but the blind and the lame will repel you, thinking, David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. Now David said on that day, Whoever climbs up by the water shaft and defeats the Jebusites, the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. Therefore they say, The blind and the lame shall not come into the house. Then David dwelt in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built all around from the Milo and inward. So David went on and became great, and the Lord God of hosts was with him. Then Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, and carpenters, and masons, and they built David a house. So David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. And David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he had come from Hebron. Also more sons and daughters were born to David. Now these are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ebhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Aladiah, and Eliphalet. Why in the world? These guys all have to marry a bunch of wives. I don't get it. Okay, so at the time of Joshua's invasion into Canaan, Jerusalem, what we call Jerusalem today, was actually called Jebus, or Jebus, J-E-B-U-S, and was the capital of the Jebusites. Now these were a warlike people. They inhabited all of the hills, the hill country, especially Judean hills around where Jerusalem was located. And the city of Jebus was given to the Benjamites as part of their inheritance by Joshua. However, they were never able to take the city and expel the Jebusites. They were never able to do it. It was one of the most heavily fortified cities in all of Canaan. And that particular part actually only consisted of a small southern section of what is today Jerusalem. So if we look at this picture, you were all trying to figure out what it said. Here is the, what would be the southern wall of Jerusalem. So more north, over here would be Mount of Olives. Here is the Dome of the Rock. You can see it sitting up here. It's not very plain, is it? I don't know what's going on there. Anyway, the city of David was this little section right here. Now, it goes a little further back, but it's just this small section. I think on your paperwork, if you look on the last page, I put a little diagram there. The city of David, you see where it says upper city, lower city, and you see David's grave. Well, this section, which is from the present wall at the bottom there, it's kind of hard to see, but you see that black rectangle over on the left side of the city there in the valley of Kibon. Right above that, you see that wall that's coming across there. That section that says David's grave, it was at that time the city of David. You all see that, right? So we're not talking about this huge city that became Jerusalem. We're talking about only that very small city. But it was very heavily fortified. You know, we've been there, and you know, the hills are very steep. I mean, you can kind of get a little idea here. The Kidron Valley, when you come up from the Kidron Valley, you come up and then, well, it's pretty steep. You know, to try to move an army up into there to take a city would be very difficult. And it's sitting on a little small hill kind of thing there. Originally, actually, it sat on 4 hills, they say. It was kind of where they all came together. So it was well fortified. Now there was only one way into that city that would work. And that was, there is no natural water that feeds Jerusalem. And the only thing they had, of course, city of David especially at this time, was a spring of Gihon. Now the spring of Gihon, let's see if I think I have it here. Well, this gives you a little idea of what it would look like to try to climb up and take the city. You have to come up this kind of a cliff thing to get there. Oh, and by the way, here is just some pictures. They've actually unearthed, they think this is the house of David here. They've unearthed them. Well, it's just the foundation stones. I mean, everything else is gone, you know. But they have excavated, this is an excavation, and they have looked at this, and they think this is probably David's house from inscriptions and stuff that they found around the house. This gives you a little better sight of it here.
Yeah.
You kind of see what that looks like. Anyway.
It's kind of fudgy.
Yeah, it's this thing. It's casting it and it's messing it up for some reason. But this well, I had some other things I could have shown, but I don't think you can see them, it's so blurry. This spring started above Jerusalem, above the level of the city. And so what they did is they tunneled from this spring, this natural spring that's up in the hills just above Jerusalem. They actually tunneled under the city. And the Jebusites, they brought tunnels in, and they were able to take the water from this spring and actually bring it down into Jebus. And so they had a natural supply of water then through these tunnels. On the outside of the tunnel, they took it down, and it actually exited into the Kidron Valley, which would be well, that's pretty clear all of a sudden.
Yeah, it is now.
Wow. This down in here is one of the houses, a traditional house. There's a lot of stuff out on the web if you ever get a hankering to go out there and look at it. Anyway, so this spring came down through here like this, and then exited into what is now Kidron Valley over here. Now, in order to get into the city, you could go down into the Kidron Valley and for the entrance of these tunnels and come through the tunnels into the city. The problem is, what they found is that this entrance to these wells were very well fortified. They had towers and guards, and, you know, they realized this would be the way in. So when David went to take the city, the inhabitants hollered at David, or, you know, said, "Even the blind and lame can protect the city from you." Which, to David, you know, that was kind of like pouring kerosene on the fire, you know. And it says here that they were hated by David's soul. That's how he thought about them. And they just, you know, we don't have to worry about it. Even the lame and the blind can protect the city. What evidently they did was they took their main forces and they were only looking at the entrance to these tunnels. So if you could destroy the people guarding the entrance to the tunnels, there wouldn't be anybody in the city probably but the lame and the blind. That'd keep out everybody left because they didn't think they needed to protect it, see? Overconfidence. So David, of course it says here, he took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David, which is this section. But he said to anybody, anybody who will lead a group up these tunnels and defeat the city, lead them up the tunnels, you're going to be commander of my army. And so apparently it was Joab that led him up there. And we don't learn much about the battle, because it probably wasn't much. After they defeated the guards at the opening to the tunnels, they just came through and went on through these tunnels. You can go out, there's actually video going through these tunnels out there. It's very, very interesting. I watched a couple of them. Now, the city of Jebus itself is interesting in more than one way. Of course, it was the capital of the Jebusites. But who were the Jebusites? And so there's a lot of question about who these guys actually were. They were some of the original inhabitants of Canaan. We know that because they appear in the Registry of Nations in Genesis. Some feel they were part of the Hittites. And, you know, and they just have, nobody knows. It's pure conjecture. However, there is a story in Abraham that we're all very familiar with, and that's when Abraham came back from chasing the robbers, you remember? And he was met in the way by a guy by the name of Melchizedek from the city of Salem. That's Jebus in Abraham's day. It was the same city. It's also interesting that a man by the name of Aranon, or Onan, sold his threshing floor to Solomon. Sold the threshing floor to David, and that was what we call today the Temple Mount, where Solomon built the temple, his first temple. And Zadok, who was a high priest under both David and Solomon, may have been a Jebusite. So, you know, you wonder about these Jebusites, and so all of a sudden everybody's wondering, you know, how could a priest be a Jebusite, you know, so forth. But there's also some thought that the Jebusites had so intermingled with the inhabitants, the Hebrews, that they actually became Jews. You know, after so many marriages, you kind of do that. And probably, and very possibly, they also were descendants of Melchizedek, and he very well could have had a whole different religious structure rather than the idolatrous structure of Canaan. So it's quite interesting when you get into it. The scholars don't know, you know, they each have their own ideas. But it's quite a kind of a mystery who these people actually were. We do know that they were never defeated, they're never completely driven out. They just were assimilated, and they became part of Israel. So that's kind of an interesting part here. All right. All right, so it says that David, after he took the city, he renamed it City of David. Now we might look at that and say, you know, that's kind of, that's interesting. He names it after himself, you know. But I think there was a purpose behind that. Because he was the chief figure for Israel. And naming it after himself kind of solidified that as being the capital. It says on to say, it says, David became great, and the Lord of hosts was with him. And he became pretty great. He really did. And just before that, it says David built all around from Milo and inward. Now, that sounds kind of strange. There's also references later on in the scriptures about the house of Milo, which meant that somebody be that person by the name of Milo and his descendants. But what it means here is evidently in this city of Jebus, there was a large structure on the north side, which would have been up here facing the walls of Jerusalem now. A large fortified structure. Now, whether that was a fort or whatever it was called Milo, and it was well known. And so, you know, if you didn't have Jerusalem, if you took all of that out of there, and there was nothing there but this little town, which would be here before Jerusalem was built, you know, if you came over Scorbus, you remember Mount Scorbus, you got up there and you had this beautiful view of Jerusalem. That was one of the last places we went. It was really pretty. But if you were coming that direction, the road would take you that way. And what you would then see is this village or this city up there. It would not be as big as it is now, but just the city, which Jebus, and you would see this fortress sitting there. So it would kind of tell people, don't try to come up here, you know, unless you're invited. It was just that big. And David began to build from that back southward. So what it says is from there back, he began to build all of this with houses and roads and began to make a more modern city out of this area here. And that would probably include strengthening walls and so forth. Eventually, of course, they moved south. Under Solomon, they built the Temple Mount, and then Jerusalem began to move south. And that's what we see today. If you look at the maps, on your map there, you have the old city, and all of that was slowly built until today. The modern Jerusalem heads out further north from all of this.
Is that Zion?
Hmm?
Is that Zion?
Zion?
Yeah, or is it the whole thing?
Zion is the Temple Mount.
Okay, so it's
Yeah, that's where the
upper
Mosque
city
of Omar is today.
over here.
Yeah. And you see where it says New City.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not really
Zion.
a new city, but
The
that's,
Temple Mount's there.
of the ancient cities, that's the new city, okay? New Jerusalem, as we know it now, is beyond that gate, beyond that top wall, and it just takes off out there, the modern Jerusalem. By the way, Golgotha, you'll see that just below the Bethesda. We're just going to come to the left and down, and you'll see Golgotha, and that's where Calvary, the Garden Tomb is.
Yeah.
Okay, so he built all of this, and while he was in the process, Hiram, who was a Phoenician king, the Phoenicians were known for their craftsmanship, and he was king of Tyre, which was a big commerce, point of commerce. It was shipping. It was where all the goods came and went, a good portion of them, through the port there at Tyre. And he was evidently so impressed with David's ability to take the city and of course rename it the City of David. And he heard all about what he was doing, and he was so impressed that he sent workmen to David with the express purpose of building him a house. Now that would be like today, like if you know, you did something and all of a sudden a guy knocks on your door and, hi, I am architect so-and-so, very famous architect, and he says, by the way, I'm going to build you a house and I'm bringing all of my workmen in. Oh, and we're getting the finest material. It was the cedars, and they came from Lebanon. They had to be cut in Lebanon and down to Tyre, and then brought across from Tyre to David's, the City of David. All this, evidently, Hiram was paying for. Now, what kind of a gift would that be? You know?
Marvelous.
Yeah, and so they built David a house, and I'm sure it wasn't a little 4-bedroom house.
No.
This was his palace that was being built. And David makes a very interesting statement here. After Tyre sent all these people down, masons, and they built him a house, in verse 12, so David knew. David knew. He didn't know before that? That the Lord had established him as king over Israel.
He had to know.
Seems kind of strange, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But when you look at it from this perspective, and of course you have to kind of project yourself back to those days, prior to the building of his house, he was just a nomadic king. There were nomads all around, traveled through. King so-and-so, and none of them had a palace. They all lived in tents and traveled around. He was just, I mean, he had the City of David, but he was just there, and you know, he might take off tomorrow and move someplace else. But when he built his palace, when God built him a palace, is what I should say, when God built him a palace, then he understood that God had established him, had put roots down, made a foundation. He is now the king. He has his palace. And he says, it was not for his sake, but for the people's. And that was his whole attitude. And of course, why I don't know, but he took all kinds of wives and more kids.
He just went crazy.
I don't know. So
Went wacko.
if he was around today, I think I would refer him to somebody.
Yeah.
Check him out, see what's going on.
What's the matter with you?
One thing to note there, among those kids that were born there, was
The
one.
names.
What's that?
Those crazy names they had.
Yeah, yeah. One of the children born at Jerusalem was Solomon.
Solomon.
All right, chapter 17. Now when the Philistines heard that they had anointed David king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. And David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. The Philistines also went and deployed themselves in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, go up, for I will doubtless deliver the Philistines into your hand. So David went to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. And he said, the Lord has broken through my enemies before me, like a breakthrough of water. Therefore he called the name of that place Baal Perazim. And they left their images there, and David and his men carried them away. Then the Philistines went up once again, and deployed themselves in the valley of Rephaim. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, and he said, You shall not go up. Circle around behind them and come upon them in front of the mulberry trees. And it shall be when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees, then you shall advance quickly, for then the Lord will go out before you to strike the camp of the Philistines. And David did so as the Lord commanded him, and he drove back the Philistines from Geba as Gezer. Yeah. Gives me goosey bumps. So here we have the Philistines. Now these were the same Philistines that David was going to go fight with, if you remember. Now most commentaries think that because Achish is not mentioned by name, he may have died by this time, who was the king of Gath, you know, who had befriended David. So he very well may have either died by now or been overthrown, you know, they didn't last very long in those days anyway. But the Philistines decided, we've got to stop this before David becomes too strong. If we move now, we can probably defeat him. So they got their armies together and they went out to look for David. Now what's interesting here is in verse 1 up here. All the Philistines went up to search for David, and David heard of it, and he went down to the stronghold. Now, we know he had a city that was considered the most, well-guarded, hardest city to defeat in all of Palestine. And yet he left the city with his and went down to the stronghold. The stronghold here that it seems to be mentioned was the cave of Adullam. You remember when he was running for Saul, he went to the cave of Adullam. Right. Well, he knew that area. He knew those caves. He knew all how they were connected. That was his old stomping grounds. Only now, instead of bringing 600 men, he brought an army with him. And so he went to Adullam. Now, we don't even know if the Philistines knew for sure where he was. The map, I didn't print up a map on this one. Adullam, if you would look to where Jerusalem is, Adullam would be over and down. It was about maybe 10 miles down to the caves of Adullam. The Philistines came in right in front of Jerusalem, or in front of Adullam, and kind of runs up this way is this valley. It's the valley of the Rephaim. Now these were, that's the name for the Rephaims, were the giants. So it's called the Valley of the Giants. And they spread their army down through this valley. It's a very fertile little valley. It's very nice. So if you think about it, here you have David up in the hills overlooking the end of the valley. So he's looking down, this valley goes out this way. And Jerusalem is back over this way. Jebus at that time, back over this way. He took his army out of Jebus, so the people were safe. They weren't going to have to fight for the city over there. Took them over here. Here he is looking down this valley with all these Philistines spreading down through the valley. And when the Philistines came, they came, we got 30,000 chariots and we've got 100,000 footmen. This would be a big army. But notice what David did. He's not Saul, He went in and inquired of the Lord. He said, shall I go up against the Philistines? Now right there is where Saul would have stopped. Should I go up against the Philistines? God said, sure, go up against the Philistines. Am I going to win? No. You can go up there if you want to. But David was very, very specific. Should I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hand? We sometimes stop short when we're asking God questions, and He wants us to be specific. He wants us to ask specifically for what we want. Should I get a new car? Yeah, get a new car. So you run down and buy a Cadillac. You know, yeah, he said you can have a new
Yeah, go
car,
ahead.
but he didn't necessarily mean for you to spend that much money. And we're that way though, you know, we just want to get enough from God so we feel like He agrees with whatever it is we want to do. And we really need to have the attitude of David and be very, very specific. If I go to battle, God, are you going to give me the victory? Am I going to win? Yes. And notice God's answer. I really like this. He says, go up, for I will doubtless deliver. He didn't leave any room for David to say, that wasn't a very good answer. I don't know if we should do it or not. No, there's no doubt. There is no question that it's already there. And so David gets his army together, and it doesn't tell us very much about what went on, except that he went down there and defeated him. And David, notice what he does. He names the name of the place. He calls it Bar Perazim. Bar Perazim. That means the Lord of breakings through. The Lord of breakings through. You know, if we want to get a breakthrough from God, no matter what that is, if we ask Him specifically for that, the answer He will give us is doubtless I will give it to you, if we're specific. Or He will say no. But if we want a breakthrough with God, and there's a lot of people that say, you know, I don't feel the Spirit like I used to, and and we don't have the power of God anymore, and yeah, you don't have it. When was the last time you asked for it? When was the last time you asked for it? We come down the altar. I know because I'm down there and I see people and I pray with people and they say, God, I need a breakthrough. God, okay. What do you need a breakthrough for? What is it you want? Oh, I just need a breakthrough. That's what the sermon was on this morning, so I'm coming down saying, God, I want a breakthrough. We don't apply what we hear to our own lives to the point where we ask the specific questions God wants us to ask. If we ask Him for a breakthrough, if it's financials or whatever it is, we need to get down before God and say, God, there's my problem. And I need to have this fixed. Now, are you going to help me fix this? Well, we know He is. He said, cast all your care upon Him, and He'd do that. How are you going to help me? What do I need to do? Specific questions, and let God help you. And what you will experience is, like David did, a breakthrough. In other words, I didn't have to do nothing. I just took my army down, and it was just like there was a flood in front of us. That's what he's referring to here, the flood of waters. And as they marched down, this flood just went down through the Philistines. And they just came along behind, collecting the swords and the spoils and the idols and whatever, and burned them, and that was that. From the sound of it, it wasn't much of a battle. And the victory was his, and it was over with. And it looks like most commentators feel it was probably the next year. Here come the same bunch again. You think they would learn? How many times were they defeated trying to defeat Israel? I mean, David, how many times did he defeat him before he started running from Saul? How many times did Saul defeat him? And now David's king, and he's doing the same thing again. And here they come again. You know, we think we can defeat the devil. We think we can defeat our adversary just by one time. You can't. He's going to keep coming.
Yeah.
He's just as dumb as these Philistines. He started out trying to be better than God. He started out, I'm going to have my throne above, and he's still working on it today.
Yeah.
And he's not going to quit until he gets that chain put around him and thrown into the pit. He's not going to quit until then. All right. So here a year later or so, Here they come again. It doesn't give us all the details this time, but I imagine David did the same thing, went down to the cave of Adullam in that area and got his army. And this time he inquires of God again. He says, should I go up with him? And this time God has a different answer. You know, same question, different answer. Sometimes we ask God several times for different things, and each time we may get a different answer from God. Just because he answered you that way the last time doesn't mean that's what he wants you to do this time. That's why you have to be so flexible with God. Because he changes things. He doesn't change, but he changes the things for you. He may want you to be in a different place, have a different ministry, use a different gift. He's going to put you where he needs you. And so he said to David, he says, yeah, you're going to go down, but don't go down now. I don't want you to go the way you went last time.
Right.
I don't want you to go up and fight him head on. I want you to circle around the back. And of course, David and his men knew those caves. They knew that area. They knew how to get around to the back, and the Philistines would never know they were there. And go to a place where these mulberry trees. These trees are Baca trees. You hear the Baca Valley mentioned every once in a while today. It's one of the names over there. And this was just a tree. I guess it was similar to a mulberry of some kind. But he said, I want you to go into that mulberry forest, and I want you just to stand there. Wait. Don't do anything. Just be there. And when you hear a sound like marching in the treetops, then don't wait. You attack now. I'll tell you, one of the best sermons I ever heard was a sermon preached on the marching in the mulberry trees. You know, remember Elijah and his servant were up on the hill, and here come Ahab and all. They were all going to destroy him. You know, and his prophet, his servant, was all upset, and he said, "We're all going to die." And Elijah, he's sitting in his recliner, maybe a lawn chair. He had his iced tea, and he's just sitting there. Whatever he had, he was just sitting there. And this servant is just going nuts. And finally God just says, God, would you just open his eyes? And what did he see?
Whoa.
The armies of heaven surrounding them. I like to think that God said, you go wait in the mulberry trees, and when you hear that marching in the trees, that's my army. And when you hear them in the trees, that means they're going in front of you. And when you hear that, you come out of those trees. Because God is going to give you the victory. Now, he didn't hear anything the first time. The first time, it was just like waters going down through there, but he didn't see, he didn't hear, he just went down, and these Philistines were all, you know. But this time, God allowed him to at least hear what was going on. The armies of heaven. You can have 300,000 troops out there, and God's going to double it with his army of heaven. He's got far more than you could any enemy can ever put together. Can you imagine what David must have felt? Oh, standing there wondering what's going to happen, and all of a sudden he hears this up in the trees. What an experience. You see, because of David's faithfulness, God allowed him just to at least hear how he was bringing victory. Wow. I wonder what he would do for us today. All right. Let's move ahead. We'll move on now to chapter 6. David brings the ark to the city of David. 2 Samuel chapter 6, beginning with verse 1. Again, David gathered all the choice men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Bele, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, whose name is called the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubims. So they set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drove the new cart. And they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, accompanying the ark of God. And Ahio went before the ark. Then David and all the house of Israel played music before the Lord on all kinds of instruments of fir wood, on harps, on stringed instruments, on tambourines, on sistrums, and on cymbals. So here we see David. He went out and got together 30,000 of the choicest soldiers. And the notion here is that he wanted protection, wanted to have a pretty good force with him in case the Philistines decided to come and keep them from getting the ark. Now the ark had been in the house of Abinadab for 20 years. You'll remember defeated Israel clear back under the judges. Samuel was just taking his position as prophet, and they came and defeated the army of Israel and took the ark. And you'll remember they took it home, and it didn't take very long. Everywhere they moved it, they got diseases and people were dying, and it was a curse. And so they put it on a new cart, and they headed it off towards Israel. And the oxen pulled the cart, and they went as far as Kiriath Jearim. And when they got there, you remember the people were all joyous, and they took the ark and killed the oxen, if you remember, and offered the sacrifice. And then somebody decided to look in the ark. And that was a mistake. And so, anyway, they wanted to get rid of that ark right now. And so they put it in the house of Abinadab. It was a house up on the hill. Now, Abinadab was a Levite. And he took care of the ark for 20 years. Now, we don't know if at this time Abinadab was still alive. You know, it was the house of Abinadab, but he may not have been there. David decided, and we don't know why he decided, but he just decided he was going to bring the ark home. So he got 30,000 of his choice soldiers, a bunch of people together, and obviously they were musicians and dancers. Now it says here, and all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God. If we're not careful here, we assume he was in Baal Judah, but he wasn't. That's where he went. And they went from there with the ark. He left from the city of David or Jerusalem. He didn't have the ark. So we had to go get it. Once he got it, now he came with the ark from there and with the people. So there was all kinds of stuff out there about why David was there and started from there. And he didn't. That just means he went there to get it. And so this word Baal Judah is another name for Kiriath Jearim. That's where that comes from. All right. Now there's also another some confusion here also in the English. It says Baal Judah, to bring up from the ark of God, whose name is called by the name the Lord of hosts, and who dwells between the cherubims. Some people think that was the name of the ark. It wasn't the name of the ark. The ark did not have a name. It was merely the name of the God who dwelled in the ark, or dwelled between the cherubims. He didn't dwell in the ark, but between the cherubims. Now it does say that in Deuteronomy 28:10, 1 Kings 8:43, and Isaiah 41, that God sits upon the cherubim, or between the cherubims on the mercy seat. That's Deuteronomy 28:10.
Yes, on there.
If you're writing it down.
It's right here.
Oh, it's in there.
It's on
Okay,
there.
it's in
It's
there.
already here.
I thought I put them in.
You didn't.
Now it's interesting here that in everything David did, he always thought, you know, every time he had to go to battle, the first thing he'd do was go ask God about it. Now he's going to bring the Ark of God home, and he doesn't bother to ask God about it. It seems like David was so fixated on battles. Of course, he was raised a warrior. I mean, but he was so fixed on that he wanted to make sure he got victory and that God was glorified. So he always asked God. But when it came to a menial task, we're just going to go pick the ark up and bring it home. How simple is that? And I'm sure he got the idea of the new cart from the Philistines. They put it on a new cart, shipped it off, it got there fine, no problem. That must be what we're supposed to do. And so they started off with the ark on a new cart, headed from Kiriath Jearim, headed towards the city of David. He didn't seek anything from God. Now there were two guys that went with it. They were both the sons of Abinadab. That meant they were also Levites. Uzzah and Achiel, that's the way to pronounce it. And so they were the ones driving the cart. Now this would have been an ox cart, had an ox, of course, in front, maybe a team of oxen. And so one person would go in front of the ox, or oxen, and lead them where they needed to go, and the other one would be behind the oxen with a prod, make sure they kept moving. So that was kind of the situation. And then behind them were all the people, and they were playing all types of musical instruments as they went. I can see this, people stop and say, what is this coming by? I mean, they had harps, they had drums, they had cymbals, they had all kinds of musical instruments, and they were probably singing as they took the ark home. I mean, that had to have been a great occasion. And so here they come down the road. Now how far they went, we don't know. But they got as far as Nachon's threshing floor. And let's go on reading verse 6. And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error, and he died there by the ark. And David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah, and he called the name of the place Perez Uzzah, or Perit Uzzah, until this day. So they seemed to be doing pretty good until they got to this threshing floor of Nachon, or Nachon's threshing floor. Now, where exactly that was located, they're not sure, but they do think it was just outside the city of David. They had probably gotten almost all the way to the city of David. And here they come to this threshing floor. Now, there's some speculation. I mean, some of these commentators, they speculate about everything. And so they speculate that probably when they got to the threshing floor, there was some grain on the threshing floor, and so the oxen turned aside to get some grain and tipped the cart. I don't know. Maybe he tripped over the rock. I don't know. And somebody left the grinding stone out there. Who knows? But for some reason, he stumbled. And Uzzah was a Levite. However, he was not a priest, at least not at this point. He was a Levite, but he was not a priest. The difference being, in order to touch the ark, you had to be consecrated. When you were in the service as a priest, you had been consecrated. Now, priests only were in, well, of course, the temple worship was a little bit different, but they only served for a certain period of time, and then they went back to their property. When they weren't serving, they were not consecrated. So they may be a priest today, tomorrow they're not a priest. If they touched the ark at that point, they would have been in violation of God's law. Become consecrated, you're in good shape. So the problem here wasn't that he was not a Levite, because he was. His dad was a Levite. He was therefore a Levite, and that's all the tribes. But it was because he wasn't a consecrated priest at this point. The imminent danger to the ark did not outweigh the importance of keeping God's commandments. You know, you've heard me say it a lot, there's always a lot of yes buts. God says, this is what I want, yes, but God, you don't understand. But God, you know, God is not interested in our observance. He's interested in our observance or our sacrifices. He's interested only in the fact that we obey Him. That's what got Saul ultimately in trouble. It wasn't the sacrifice that God was concerned about, it was obedience. Disobedience is what makes God angry, not our lack of sacrifice. We sometimes, and there's groups out there, you know, they feel that because they're doing good works, that's all it takes. I'm sacrificing of my time, my efforts, and my money, therefore I'm in good shape. That's not what God's interested in. He wants you to sacrifice, sure, that's all part of it. But His major concern is that you obey. If you disobey, He becomes angry. And the Bible says you don't want to fall into the hands of an angry God. The lesson from Uzzah. All right. Now, from the account of this same event that's found in 1 Chronicles chapter 15, verse 2 and verse 13, David may have been more angry at the Levites, who should have known how to move the ark and have followed God's instructions. It says here that David became mad. He got angry with God about this. But when you read the account in 1 Chronicles, it seems more that he was more angry with the Levites, who should have known how to move the ark. Uzzah should have known how to move the ark. He should have read Deuteronomy. He was a Levite. I mean, they should have known you don't move the ark on a cart. You put it on the poles and you have the priest carry the ark. That's how you move it. And of course, David didn't bother to ask God about it. I mean, he just assumed. And I think he was angry from that account in Chronicles. His anger was not directed at God. His anger was directed at the Levites, who should have known and didn't know. Just a little side thing here. I think it's easy to read that and say, well, David got mad at God. I don't think he got so mad at God as he did mad that things weren't done right. That seemed to be more of in the tone of David. Verse 9. David was afraid of the Lord that day. And he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? So David would not move the ark of the Lord with him into the city of David. But David took it aside into the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. So David, when he sees Uzzah die on the side of the road by the ark, David says, how can I take this into the city of David? How can I take this into my house? The fear here is the awe, or the he wasn't afraid God was going to strike him dead or anything like that so much as it was just the sheer power and awe that comes when you see God do something like this. if Uzzah, who was a Levite, got struck dead for just touching the ark, what will God do to me if I bring it into my house, into my city?
And somebody else touch it.
It made him think twice. And in this case, it was good. So he took the ark and he put it, I don't know who touched it. I've often wondered about this. One of they just took the cart and pushed it in the house and left it. I don't know how they did it. But they put the house in the ark in the house of Obed-Edom. Now, Obed-Edom was a Levite of the family of Merari, according to 1 Chronicles chapter 15 and 16. He was the son of Jeduthun, who was a Merari. He was a porter, a player on the harp, and was one of the Levites especially designated to take part in the musical services on the occasion of bringing the ark to Zion, and to minister before it when brought up. He is called a Gittite, perhaps from Gath Rimmon in Manasseh, which belonged to the Kohathites, according to Joshua 21:25. Marriage with a Kohathite or some other cause could account for his dwelling in a Kohathite city. Now the ark stayed in the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months, during which time he was greatly blessed of God. Some of the old rabbinical books, some of them are kind of strange. Some of them kind of border on mythology and different things. But one of them said that Obed-Edom had 6 wives, and in the 3 months that the ark was there, all 6 of them gave birth kids at the same time. And another one talked about trying to explain what it meant. You have to watch some of these rabbinic books. You wonder where they came from. But I can understand why why they're so far out there from understanding who God really is. But anyway, enough of that. So this caused David to kind of rethink things. Number one, and this I think is important, Obed-Edom sacrificed part of his house. Now, let me see if I can get that back up here. I want to show you this. This right here was a typical house. It had 4 bedrooms or 4 rooms, usually 2 down below and sometimes 2 above. Or it would have 1 long room across the back and 3 rooms that were more narrow towards the front of the house. That would have been a house that Obed-Edom lived in. And you can see from those people, that's not a very big house. Very small. It was about I think they said 600 to 800 square feet maximum in these houses. And that was very small. And they usually had a lot of people lived in there. It kind of reminds me of Philippines. You go in some of those areas around Manila, I mean, a little closet and there's kids just coming out from everywhere. Where are these kids from? Very small homes. And yet he was sacrificed part of his house to put the ark in. Now the ark was not a little tiny box. So it would have taken up a good amount of space and nobody could touch it, so it had to be.
It was going by itself. Huh?
But he was willing to sacrifice. And because of his willingness to sacrifice, God multiplied his blessings. Not only him, but his whole house, it says. Everybody with him.
Yeah, evidently all the women got pregnant at the same time.
Yeah. All right. He got more kids just like that little house. All right, verse 12. Now it was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with gladness. And so it was. This is interesting, verse 13. We don't see where this came about, but we see it here. So what was that those bearing the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces that he sacrificed oxen and fatted sheep. Then David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. Okay, we've probably all heard this story, you know. And I've heard preachers get up and talk about how, well, number one, David learned how to carry the ark. You know, and we learned in First Chronicles, it talks about David learning how to carry the ark. They got it all straight. So this priests now have the ark on their shoulders. And I've heard the sermons, you know, where they took 6 steps and then they would stop and David would kill oxen and they would have this big sacrifice and then they'd take 6 more steps and he'd do it again. All the way from Abinadab's house, you know. Well, that really wasn't kind of what happened. What did happen is they put the ark on the shoulders, on the shoulders of the priest, and they came out of Obed-Ed's house. And when they had gone 6 steps down the road, they stopped, and they offered sacrifices, and they offered burnt offerings. And this was meat that would be given in a peace offering. So when they had, and while they were offering this, they were celebrating. You know, this was a time, a feast of celebration. We're bringing the ark home. Now remember, they're just outside the city of David. And then when they had finished with the sacrifices and all, they collected all the meat, and they brought the Ark of the Covenant in. They didn't stop every time they took 6 steps. They did it once. And of course, the commentators again, you know, well, this was so they wanted to make sure that the ark didn't fall off the shoulders of the priests, and they were firmly on the road, and so then they could, you know. And I was sitting there saying, you people, you know. They just wanted to get on the road and get going. And 6 steps, and that was the place to worship. They were moving the ark. They could have gone 10 steps, they could have gone 3 steps. It doesn't matter. But they had the ark on the way home properly. And so they had all this sacrifice. Now they took all the meat from that, and we'll learn later, as they did for the peace offerings. This became the feast. Anytime they had a feast offering, you know, we've talked about it, they had a big feast. So they collected all this meat. So according to 1 Corinthians, or Chronicles 15:27, this is another misconception, is that people think David took off all of his clothes and was running around naked, jumping up and down, which is not the case. According to 1 Chronicles, David had on his royal robes as well as an ephod. This is what it says. And David was clothed with a robe of fine linen, and all the Levites that bear the ark, and the singers, and Chenaniah, the master of the psalm with the singers. David also had upon him an ephod of linen, and he danced before the Lord. So he didn't go out there and strip off all of his clothes, and you know, he didn't do that. But he just danced vigorously before the Lord. Now, the dance would have been a traditional Hebrew dance. And the word used here means to dance in a circle. So, you know, the Hebrews, or the Israelis, are famous for their circle dances. The hora is probably the most famous, and you even see it in movies, you know, when they're having a wedding, Hebrew wedding or Jewish wedding. They get in a circle and they all dance and they carry on. But it was one of those circle dances that they were dancing. And they would dance the circle dance as they came down the street following the ark. And it was a time of, you know, just great time. Now the ephod was worn by the priests when ministering before the ark, asking guidance from God and for performing priestly duties. Elders, rulers, and important personages can also wear the ephod on special occasions. David considered, this is important I think, David considered his worship in dancing before the ark to be a type of ministration and a sign of his willingness to be a servant of God. They put the ephod on every time he wanted to find out something from God. But he also put it on when he ministered before the ark. I think that's important. That's an important message here, I think. We see people dancing sometimes, and I think my wife and I were talking about it some this morning. Being raised in an old Pentecostal church, that you didn't dare dance. I still can't dance. Never could dance, probably never will dance. But there was an exception if you were dancing in the Spirit. That is a non-biblical term. There is no such thing in the book of dancing in the Spirit. Now, I'm not saying that isn't right. I've been there. I've danced in, under the Spirit. Sure. But it's just, that's one thing. But that doesn't preclude the fact that we can dance before the Lord as worship. Key as worship. We were at one church and they had a Hawaiian lady there, pretty rotund. But I'll tell you what, she would come down sometimes during the song service or worship time, and she would start dancing. Just dancing. And I'm telling you, the Spirit of God would just settle. Because she just was, of course, a Hawaiian, so graceful dancing, but it wasn't a Hawaiian thing she was doing. It was just that style, but the presence of God would just settle in there. Because she offered that as worship to God. She would take flags, and I hate flags, because they're so distracting to me. I get mesmerized watching them if I can't worship. But she would take those flags, and she'd begin to wave those. And, the power of God, it was worship, and God accepted that. Then there was others that would come down with the flags, and going through the same motions, and it was kind of like, get out of my face, put those things away. But when we offer our talents, no matter what they are, to God as a worship, God will take that. And God will use, no matter what that talent is. We sometimes like to tell God what talents He can use. Doesn't work that way. All right. That must have been quite a sight. Boy. Verse 16. Now as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David, leaping and whirling before the Lord. And she despised him in her heart. So they brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had erected for it. Then David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Then he distributed among all the people, among the whole multitude of Israel, both the women and the men, to every one a loaf of bread, a piece of meat, and a cake of raisins. So all the people departed, every one to his house. So can you picture this? Here comes the ark through the gate. Michal is looking out the palace window, and she sees her husband, King David, jumping in the air, whirling around. His robes are flying everywhere. Maybe he's even doing cartwheels. I don't know. But he is just having a time out there in this dancing. And here's all these other dancers, and they're all just jubilant, having a time. And I guess the first question I ask is, why was she in the palace and not with David? Mm-hmm. Why wasn't she out there? Why wasn't she excited about the ark coming home? And I think we can see a lot of that because of her father. Her father neglected the ark for 20 years. Why didn't Saul bring it home? He was the king. But Saul was not interested in the ark. Saul was interested in the kingdom, but not the ark. And so this was probably handed down to Michal, this idea that, you know, my father was king and he didn't need the ark, so what's the big deal about the ark? And too many today think they can live for God, think they can live for Jesus, they can be active in the church and not have the Spirit of God. How can they do it? It becomes our own rather than God's. The ark represented the presence and Spirit of God. That's where He dwelt. If you don't have the Spirit dwelling in you, how can you be what God wants you to be? See, we're building a picture here as we go through this. I hope you're kind of retaining that, of what it takes to be a man after God's own heart. Every chapter we read, we see something about David that tells us about his heart. And here we see that he had a heart to find the presence of God. To have the presence of God, not just know where it is. Oh, I know where the ark is. Yeah, it's only about 15, 20 miles. We can go over there anytime and visit the ark. We can go down to the house there of whatever his name was. We can go over there and visit it anytime. But he didn't want to just know where it was. He wanted to have it with him. He wanted it right there. And that has to be our desire. We need to have the presence of God with us all the time. All the time. Not just once in a while. All the time. And notice, the devil is always going to try to stop you from getting that. The Philistines came against David. And of course, he hadn't said anything about getting the ark. But they wanted to make sure he didn't get it. It may have brought disease and scourge to them, but they knew in the hands of David it was a mighty, mighty tool and power. And God will stop us from trying to find the presence of God. He will stop us from having the presence of God in our midst. Unfortunately, He's successful in it more than not. Now, once the ark had been placed in the tabernacle that David had erected for it there in Jerusalem, he offered both burnt offerings and peace offerings. And this was, of course, what I talked about before. This was, of course, he didn't offer them. You understand, the priest did. But he was the author. He was the host. He was the one who was doing this. So he hosted the feast. Now, of course, with everybody there, and of course, obviously, it wasn't all of Israel that was there. That town wasn't big enough for that. But it was the ones who were there that he had called to come and get the ark. So, you know, they were from probably all the different tribes. He hosted a feast. Now, there wasn't a place for everybody to sit down, I mean, you know, realistically. So what he did, he took what he had offered, the meat, and he evidently had had them already prepare loaves of bread and raisin cakes. And so everybody, every person received an allotment of meat, a loaf of bread, and a raisin cake. And then they were to go home and have a feast and celebrate in their own way the bringing of the ark. I like this, you know. I'm all for corporal. I love corporal worship. You know, I love when we have real corporal worship. And I love to feel the presence of God. And I like to get together and celebrate things, you know. I'm not much of a social person. I'm kind of a square peg in a round hole when it comes to social things. I'm not much social. But I enjoy being around it. I enjoy, you know, just being there and watching people and, you know. But it's important that we not just worship and acknowledge and celebrate what God does when we can all get together. We need to take time to celebrate in our own homes what God has done. Celebrate Him, you know. Because too often we don't even think about what God does till we walk in on Sunday morning, and that's usually when somebody reminds us. You know, then we go home and we're all wrapped up in our problems and ourselves. But we need to take the time to celebrate. I've got an emphasis to celebrate what God has done, and celebrate the fact that He is with us. He likes that celebration. Now, one thing to note here, David built this temporary tabernacle. The original tabernacle remained in Gibeon. Why do you think that was? It seems it would have been a lot easier just to pack up the tabernacle and bring it along. I mean, after all, Moses 40 years. I mean, you know, it must have been pretty easy to move. Why do you think he built a new one? Because he intended on building a permanent one. It was David's desire to build the temple. It was David's desire to build a permanent home for God. And he wasn't able to do it because he was a bloody king. But his son was. But that's why, at least that's what pretty much everybody feels. He built a temporary shelter because he knew he was going to be building a temple into which the ark would be the central figure. All right, finally, verses 20. Then David returned to bless his household. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How glorious was the king of Israel today." Maybe redo that. "How glorious was the king of Israel today, uncovering himself today in the eyes of the maids of his servants, as one of the base fellows shamelessly uncovers himself." So David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore, I will play music before the Lord, and I will be even more undignified than this, and will be humble in my own sight. But as for the maidservants of whom you have spoken, by them I will be held in honor." For Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children till the day of her death. This is kind of an interesting thing here. David blessed all the people. He pronounced a blessing on them. He was a prophet, remember. He had the spirit of the prophet on him. Remember, he went with the prophets and prophesied? No, God put that spirit on him. So he had that right to bless the people as a prophet as well as a king. Then he spiritually blessed them as a prophet, and he materially blessed them by giving them the food for the feast. Then he went home to do the same thing at home. Those in his house, because they were not at the celebration. They weren't. Some say it was tradition that the king's family did not go to those things. I don't know where that tradition would come from, but you know, since they were just starting that kingdom, anyway, I don't know. But when he gets there, he gets met by Michal at the door. Her proud royal extraction showed as she accused David of acting beneath the royal standard of conduct. How could you, as king, act the way you acted? She upbraided him. She was really in his case. And probably because while he was spinning around and doing all of his conniptions out there in dancing, he exposed part of his leg. We come from a church where if that happened in church, they'd throw you out. I think it's funny sometimes. We used to have a girl, and she's from the same background we're from. And I used to laugh, so I stand back and just shake my head and laugh. Somebody would get down on the altar. It didn't matter if anything was showing or not. She'd wrap a little blanket and cover him up. And she did that all the time. And I would sit there and I'd say, what in the world girl, are you doing? You know, but I know where she's coming from.
Right.
But yeah, you know, if you had a, especially a woman, oh, if you got to dancing and somebody saw your knee, I mean, this was, that, they would, you know, my sister-in-law even today, if something like that happened, she'd probably have a heart attack right there on the floor. We'd have to resuscitate her. They get up in this stuff. The point wasn't, you know, he wasn't doing, things he shouldn't be doing. We know that because he said, I'm going to do it again. You know, so if that was the case, he wouldn't, you know, he wouldn't have done that. No, it was simply a matter that he was willing to show his humbleness. Now, if that was a beggar off of the street, nobody would have said a word. Now, what's the difference between a beggar's leg and a king's leg? They're a leg. A leg is a leg, you know. But we tend to put so much importance on who we are rather than what we are. And when we focus ourselves on what we are, we then put ourselves as children of God, as ministers unto God. And David was willing to do that. Now, if I would have, she had said something to me like that, and I would have turned around and said to her, I was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me over the rule of the people, and I'm going to do this again, I better be running because I got cast iron fry pans. But David responded that he wasn't dancing before the Lord for anyone else except for the Lord. And of course he alludes to the fact that God took him over Saul. Why? Why? Because he had that kind of a heart that wanted to worship God. He said, I will continue to play music. I will continue to dance. I'm going to become even more undignified than I did today, so I can humble myself before God. And by the way, those maidservants you're so concerned about out there, they're going to think so poorly of me because I abandoned my kingly stature. Well, I got news for you. They're going to think better of me. They're going to hold me in higher honor because I'm willing to move away from my errors, away from my putting everything on of how important I am, and come down to the base fact that I'm just a man and I need to worship God. Oh, if we could just do that in church. And because of her tantrums against David, she had no children until the day she died. Now, that didn't mean she didn't have children prior to. I think Sharon asked last week, or Judy, asked that question last week, but she may very well have had some children by the other, and even by David prior to this event, but she had no more children until the day she died. Any questions? A little bit over.